Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Jericho, and this is going to be the fourth episode of the Angst Podcast. For this week's topic, I'm actually choosing to go over this one here and now just because I think it ties in really well with episode 2 and episode 3. In case you missed those ones, we talked a little bit about nutrition, free will, the idea behind consciousness, and maybe what makes up your decisions, or at least what voice makes up your decisions. So for this week, I'm actually going to be looking at drugs. I think a topic that kind of ties in well to maybe the health or the conscious state. And it's something that I'm going to be going over probably a lot as the episodes go on. So I think it's something that if we cover early, then I can, branch on and expand further down the road. I'm going to try to make this one short and sweet just because I don't want to ramble too much. It's definitely possible with something like this. So I'm going to turn back towards the brain just to kind of evaluate maybe what drugs are doing, or at least the impact they have on our decisions. I just want to remind everybody that we're kind of monkeys, and for the most part, we're just having an experience. Whatever it may be, whether it's the sun touching your face, a puppy runs up to your door, you're eating, you're sleeping, you're at work, you're driving, it's an experience. There's stimulus, and it's process. It's processed inside your brain through a series of nerve impulses and neurotransmitters and chemical balancing, and to be honest, stuff that's way above my head, and to be honest, maybe above most people's head if we want to get too far into how the brain actually works. But for the most part, it's a series of chemicals and neurotransmitters and responses to the stimulus in the external world. Dopamine and serotonin, prime example. I think most people kind of know what these are. These neurotransmitters are usually responsible for emotions such as happiness or just overall euphoric feelings, anything that's on the positive spectrum of emotions. And then you have the opposite end, which would maybe be depression, anxiety, sadness, sorrows. And we know that depending on where these chemicals or neurotransmitters are balanced inside your head, the certain emotion or response will occur. For most healthy people, it balances based off of the stimulus around you. But for some less than lucky individuals, they suffer from depression, and then we know the levels are a little bit out of whack. At that point, you would have to restore them, and one of the ways that we could do it is fitness, food, healthy life choices, healthy people to surround yourself with, healthy job environments. But another way is that you could prescribe medication or drugs. A lot of these do have positive effects. Some of them have negative effects or side effects, but it's definitely something that can be done because it manipulates the neurotransmitters and it changes your reality back from a depressed filter to maybe a stable or a happier filter. And that would be good, right? Obviously, that would be a positive benefit of the drug. But where things get a little odd is when we start kind of classifying which drugs are good that manipulate the levels and which drugs are bad that manipulate the levels. I'm going to break it to everybody that for the most part, we're all on drugs. Sugar's a drug. We kind of already went over that. It causes an inflammatory response in the body. It does have addictive properties. It also provides a little bit of energy, or sugar at least. That's why you can see kids that consume the substance seem to, get hyper really fast. Obvious side effect of that drug. You could consume caffeine. Again, a lot of people do. It's very beneficial in the mornings. It, releases a little bit of stress. It gives you a bit of motivation, obviously more energy, the ability to stay awake longer. That's something a lot of people can be addicted to as well. But these are minor stimulants, obviously. Bear with me. I know these are basic drugs. We could up the ante a little bit and jump into alcohol or cannabis. These drugs are obviously a little bit more intense, have a little bit higher consequences depending on the usage. And at one point been illegal in our society. We can continue along the spectrum and get a little more intense. You could go into cocaine, meth, speed. We could talk about some maybe better ones like psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine, MDMA, depending on who you're talking to, ketamine. There's a lot of interesting, psychedelics out there that maybe have a couple of positive effects. And I think what's interesting about our society, our culture, is that there's kind of lines in the sand drawn for where we're going to allow a substance or not allow a substance. It's kind of three options. You can either be legal, you could be illegal, you could require a prescription, and I guess I shouldn't have said three. I'm sure there's probably other ways to get drugs, I'm sure. But these are kind of the main categories that we would deal with for any one substance. And so a lot of people have an accepted idea of drugs that are legal, and they tend to be kind of minor for the most part. I mean, alcohol, in my opinion, does have some consequences if, large amounts are consumed, but obviously in the smaller portions, it can be quite fun and enjoyable. And it doesn't happen to everybody, these poor consequences, right? It definitely depends on the person. But that one's obviously something that's legal, and it's kind of interesting when you think of maybe why, because I'm going to point out a couple other ones, like I already mentioned, psilocybin, let's say, which is illegal, probably because of its psychedelic effects. It's very intense, and it's illegal not really for any reason I can see. I mean, there's not a lot of research on the substance, but what is there is it does seem to be somewhat depression curing. It's very intense. It's long lasting, so it doesn't require use, repeated use, I should say. It's not really addictive. And here's the other thing is, I will admit that I've actually done mushrooms, and it's just not addictive. It's too intense to be addictive. It's kind of difficult to describe, but it takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of will, I would say, maybe. And it's not something that's just going to be repeated blatantly. Again, maybe not by everybody. I'm speaking with my own experience here, but also the experience of certain studies I've read. I've listened to the Dr. Rhonda Patrick podcast. I'm going to forget the guy's name right now. I should have had that written down. But it's a podcast that she did a little while ago on psilocybin. And it's just great information, really interesting science, real science, tested, validated science. Yet our culture is going to look at it and say it's not allowed and it's illegal for, its intense and psychedelic reasons. That's kind of interesting, though, because I find what occurs in our society a lot of time is there will be individuals who don't really have experience with the substance, maybe potentially trying to dictate or tell individuals who do have experience with the substance how the substance works, what the side effects are, what they experience on it, and if it should be allowed. And I think it's kind of funny because we can point to an example like cannabis and maybe the movement that it has now has gained a lot of headway because there was a generation that went through the DARE program. And that generation was very much influenced by a war on drugs to believe that a lot of these substances were very negative. But then this thing called the internet showed up, and it gave access to a lot of access to information they wouldn't have had before, that maybe people that they looked up to or their parents could manipulate. And instead you have a generation that realized everything they were told in the DARE program was kind of bullshit, or at least a lot of it was, and that some of these drugs are actually kind of fun and maybe even beneficial. So why did all the adults lie? And then it kind of creates a trust issue, right? And it makes things a little odd. Obviously a lot more goes into the drug war with cannabis, and I'm kind of rambling here. But what I've been meaning to say is that for the most part, you have individuals who have maybe not experienced the substance telling people what it's like. And then when people try it and it's not like that, or it's not as negative, or it's totally different, well, that's kind of odd. Because if those people are using that information as their basis of if something should be legalized or not, well, then they're wrong, aren't they? And then the conversation's a little skewed and unfair. So I'm definitely all for the idea that certain drugs are very powerful and we can talk about which ones should or should not be legalized. But the conversation seems kind of closed at this point. And it's funny because there's definitely a couple of substances that I feel maybe aren't that bad. These substances can potentially grow out of the planet. We actually already ingest mushrooms in a variety of ways. Yes, some are poisonous, but I can promise you this one isn't. And it's just kind of interesting when we utilize these drugs in a positive way. There are definitely cases where individuals, if used correctly, have had beneficial experiences on certain substances. Dimethyltryptamine, MDMA, psilocybin, cannabis, alcohol even. I'll give credit to it. It's a confidence booster. Sometimes these drugs can benefit us if used correctly. And people, let's not forget that all these drugs are doing are manipulating the levels that we talked about at the start. It's the neurotransmitters, it's the hormones, it's the things that are being manipulated all day, every day by the externalities of our universe anyways. I don't know why, if you were somebody that was given an opportunity to try something safely that others that you trust have validated for you, you only get one life, and it's kind of fun to experience it in different ways, in my opinion. I think that for a lot of people, we get on a momentum track. I think for a lot of people, decisions and the way of thinking and our free will can be based off of a certain amount of momentum, where you live and what you do and who you see, and your motivation and your decisions from the day before can really influence what you're deciding for tomorrow. And I think that if you use these substances in a positive and beneficial light, and again, we are going to have further talks about which ones may or may not be beneficial, but do your research, be educated, don't blindly take the DARE program information. If anybody's religious, I just kind of want to point out that for the most part, in my opinion, I think that if there was a creator or a purpose to our existence or anything real that was going on in this universe, I think that we shouldn't be afraid of things that grow out of it then. We should educate ourselves on them and we should use them. And if people have benefits from them, we should pay attention to that because there's probably a reason. If you believe it's all random and the universe is just a series of chance, there is no real purpose, so there wouldn't really be a naturally built-in benefit substance like that. Well, then, hey, you only get one life. You're probably not coming back, in your opinion, I guess. And it's pretty fun, to be honest. There's some of them that, if used correctly, I'm not saying you have to do it all the time, but to give it a try would be kind of interesting. I think if everybody tried it at least once. And again, I understand. I know people are screaming at me right now. I understand some of these drugs can be addictive. I understand people can get addicted and people seeing their lives go downhill. I get it. I totally do. I'm not saying this is for the faint of heart. These are intense for sure. And I think it's up to the person to make the decisions for themselves, not the lawmakers to make decisions on how people will utilize their own consciousness. It's kind of funny because I think a situation that I've seen I'm going to end on here is chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is kind of a funny one because that's a drug. And this drug's obviously designed to fight off cancer and prevent cancer, or at least add a little bit of life. And in some cases, I've seen it work, obviously. It does have, we wouldn't be dealing with it if it didn't work. But I've had personal experiences with friends and family who have gone through the process and it doesn't work. And I've also seen them go through the process suffering. And yes, we could point fingers at 1,000,001 things. But I do know that going into chemo is really hard on the body. And some people make it through, and I get it's a good chance. So if you decide it's worth it, you decide it's worth it. But it can also be a really brutal time, and it doesn't have any guarantees. But as a free will thinking adult, you can make the decision, I guess, hey? I find that odd with a substance so intense and difficult to really see the positive and negatives like chemotherapy, yet you can have other substances like psilocybin or cannabis not be allowed because people aren't capable of making decisions for themselves. I think it's kind of odd. I know there was a lot of do drugs advocacy there, and that's definitely not where I want to leave off. So I'm just going to remind everybody to be smart and do your own research. I just think it's kind of interesting the way that a lot of people have looked at it throughout the years, and I don't really know if everybody's been blindly following or actually making their own decisions for a little while. But thanks for tuning in, guys, and we'll see you next week.